as you see from the first slide, I want to talk about a good tool for what we hope is to reducing the risk of transmission of airborne pathogens, and of course, specifically SARS-CoV-2, but would also apply equally well to influenza, for example. So here's the question. Here's what we really want to do. We want to decrease the transmission of airborne viruses in occupied spaces, and so limit indoor airborne disease transmission. And again, not only for SARS-CoV-2, but for other airborne viruses too. So here's my claim that, in fact, we already know really well how to effectively kill every kind of microbe, and we've known that for well on 100 years, and that's with ultraviolet light. So I don't need to say to this audience what ultraviolet light is. It's just a slightly shorter wavelength than visible light, and infrared on the other side. And it's reasonably well understood how UV light and UVC in particular inactivates viruses and bacteria too, basically by producing some DNA damage, which ultimately produces dimers, both in whether it be a DNA virus and RNA virus. And such a dimer makes, if it's in the right place, would make it hard for the microbe to replicate. And one of the nice things about this approach is that it's almost certainly, because it certainly hasn't been tested, going to be equally effective at inactivating mutant viral variants as opposed to the parent virus. And of course, we're all very concerned about the Delta virus these days, and it's, I would say, almost 100% certain that UV will be equally effective against the Delta variant as it is against any other variant and the parent virus. So I said before that we've known for a long time that UV is very good at killing airborne viruses. So that being the case, what you'd really like to do in principle is just simply install overhead UVC lights in public spaces. And here's a few artists' impressions of that. But you can't do that with conventional germicidal UV light, which is 254 nanometers, a mercury lamp, because it's potentially a health hazard. It's a health hazard both to the skin and to the eye. So if you want to use conventional germicidal 254 nanometer mercury lamps, you have to essentially do things indirectly. One approach is to irradiate only the upper room air and then try and circulate the air around. But what I'm going to be talking about today is directly exposing or irradiating the room to UV light, an occupied room, I should say. And what I'm going to be talking about is 222 nanometer light, which is sort of slap in the middle of the UVC range. And just to compare that with conventional germicidal UV, not actually very different. That's 254 nanometers, and I'm going to be talking about 222 nanometers. So yeah, a lot of people have said, what's the big deal? It's just so little difference in wavelength, but actually it makes a world of difference in terms of safety. And the reason is this. So what I'm showing here is the absorption of photons, UV photons, as a function of wavelength in proteins. And there is a protein resonance essentially around 200 nanometers. So you can see at 254 that the UV light is not well absorbed by proteins at all, but at 222 it is, and that's the fundamental difference. And so why is that so important? Well, basically, it means that the penetration of the 222 UV light is very, very different from the penetration of the 254 nanometer light in biological materials, because all biological materials contain proteins, of course. So this cartoon, what you see here is conventional 250. This is a cartoon of the surface of the skin. And what you see is that 254 nanometer light can very easily penetrate to the epidermis and occasionally even to the basal layer of the epidermis. Whereas the 222 nanometer light is essentially absorbed in the stratum corneum of the skin. The stratum corneum being the layer of dead cells on the very surface of our skin. That's cells that have sloughed off from the epidermis. So it doesn't matter at all if you dump energy into the stratum corneum, because these are dead cells. They can't produce any biological consequences. Whereas the epidermis, of course, they're live cells, so there are potential biological consequences. So that's the basic idea behind the safety of 222 nanometer light. So contrast that with the size of microbes, bacteria or viruses, which are much, much smaller on the scale of this picture. So 222 nanometer light can very easily penetrate through a bacteria or a virus or even a cluster of viruses. So in terms of the penetration, the lack of penetration doesn't affect its ability to damage airborne microbes, but it does affect its ability to penetrate into the skin. And likewise the eye. And these are basically the two tissues that we worry about, the two organs that we worry about in terms of UV light, the skin and the eye. So the skin is protected by the stratum corneum. The eye is protected by a layer of what's called the tear layer, which is right on top of the cornea. So you have the cornea, and on top of that is the tear layer. And much of the tear layer is actually an aqueous layer of water, which you see blown up in this picture. So again, you have protection from damage to the eye, to the cornea, by what's in front of the eye, similar to what's in front of the epidermis, which is the stratum corneum. So there are only two questions in the Far-UVC light world. Is it safe, and does it work? So I'm going to spend most of my time talking about that. So let's start with, is it safe? And the first argument for that is it's the biophysics that I just talked about. It's simply that the Far-UVC light can't penetrate to living cells in the skin and the eye. The second argument is, well, actually, there is an existing regulatory framework that's been around for many decades, and we are not proposing, and never would propose, that we should go above those regulatory limits. So whatever we propose is going to be within the current regulations of how much UV light at a particular wavelength people can be exposed to. So that's the second argument. And the third is, well, since we proposed the idea of Far-UVC light, this differential between human biological damage and microbial biological damage, lots of people have been doing safety studies to test just that. And certainly in the last 2 years, as the COVID crisis has hit, there's been increased interest in this, and there have been a lot more papers actually published about it in all sorts of different models, in human skin, in models of human skin, in mouse skin and mouse eyes. So turning to the regulatory framework. So the regulatory framework that exists right now is the picture that you see on the left here. So they're phrased in terms of TLVs, threshold level values, which are the recommended maximum amount of Far-UVC, or sorry, UV light that people can be exposed to per 8 hours or per 24 hours or whatever. And this is the current regulatory curve. And if you go to 222, it's 23 millijoules per centimeter squared per 8 hours. So that certainly, if as it's deployed at the moment, one should keep within that regulatory limit. So at the beginning of this year, the ACGIH, which is the organization that makes these limits, published a NIC, Notice of Intent to Change. And essentially, taking into account all this new safety data that's around, they actually proposed that the TLV should be increased quite significantly. In fact, 18-fold for the skin and 5-fold for the eye. So that, as of now, I think that how it works is once an NIC is proposed, the public has a year to comment on that, which I think is about finished now. So don't know what the ACGIH will do, but I think it gives some indication that the ACGIH thinks that the current regulations are certainly safe, and they're willing to actually relax them quite significantly. But nevertheless, I'm thinking of the Far-UVC light within the framework of the current regulations. In terms of the safety studies that have been going on around the world in the last couple of years, well, this is a slide I made through 2020. So I haven't included any 2021 figures because I ran out of space. But what you can see is there's a variety of safety studies from a variety of different groups, both in this country, mostly in this country, Europe, and Japan. And the conclusion from these, I should say the conclusions from these studies is that there's been no evidence of any adverse health effects. But I'm going to give one little proviso in a moment. And here is that proviso. So Far-UVC lamps, which I'll talk about in a little more detail in a moment, which are essentially excimer lamps. The krypton chloride excimer lamp, this is the output spectrum, has a peak at 222 nanometers, but actually has quite a long tail of longer wavelength light. Pretty small tail. This is on a log scale here, so these are already more than 2 orders of magnitude down. But these are the spectra without any filtering. You can actually very much reduce this tail by putting a filter in front of the lamp, and these are typical results without filters, where you can basically drop the high wavelength tail by at least an order of magnitude, typically more. So the rationale for that is a couple of papers here. So this paper on the left was the one paper out of all the ones that have been published that has shown some erythema or DNA damage in exposed human skin. This was a paper that was published in 2015, actually irradiating human skin in healthy human volunteers. This was the only study of all the safety studies that have been done without a filter. So some 5 years later, that study was essentially repeated with a UV lamp with a filter, and that's this paper on the right here. And they did not see any induced erythema or DNA damage. So the conclusion, which you can draw from this paper, but there's plenty of other evidence too, is that the high wavelength tail of that Far-UVC spectrum from an excimer lamp is potentially a health hazard. So these lamps have to be used with filters as they stand. And essentially all the manufacturers that are making these lamps are making them with filters. So with that proviso that you do need a filter to get rid of these high wavelength components, there's a lot of evidence from a variety of sources about that they are safe for human exposure. So the second question, having thought about is it safe, does it work? And I see some, yeah, somehow half this slide's got itself cut off. Not sure why, but the data is on the left-hand side of this slide. So this was actually a paper published very recently, and it was comparing different coronaviruses with in terms of their effectiveness with different lamps. So there's a couple of LED lamps here. Here's the conventional 254 nanometer light. And here is the conventional 222 excimer lamp, both filtered and unfiltered. And there are two conclusions that you can draw from this, which somehow got cut off on the right here. The first is that 222 nanometer light is in general more biologically effective than 254 nanometer light. So its ability to kill coronaviruses is rather bigger than conventional 254 nanometer light. And the other conclusion that one can draw from this is that using seasonal human coronavirus, it's basically the sorts of coronaviruses that we've been exposed to forever and give us common colds and so on, have reasonably similar responses to the response of the SARS-CoV-2 coronaviruses. And the reason that's important is that the airborne studies of coronaviruses, I'm going to talk about in a moment, doing airborne studies of SARS-CoV-2 is incredibly hard, and trying to get permission to do an airborne study of SARS-CoV-2 is well and nigh impossible. I tried at Columbia and no dice. So what we do is do airborne studies of seasonal human coronaviruses like the 229E virus. So it's encouraging that, in fact, what you see here is that using seasonal coronaviruses is a reasonable but slightly conservative model for SARS-CoV-2. So coming to the studies that essentially we did on characterizing the efficacy of Far-UVC for killing airborne human coronaviruses. So we use this setup on the top right here. Essentially, we generated aerosolized human coronaviruses. We used two different ones called here OC43 and 229E. On the left, we generated an aerosolized flow of these coronaviruses. And then essentially we flowed them across this irradiation chamber here. And here's a Far-UVC lamp, which I turned towards the camera just so you can see it, but in the experiment, it would be facing that window. So that the viruses flow across this window, and we collect them in a collector at the far end, and then we assay as to whether they are active or inactivated, alive or dead, essentially. So that's the way that we can directly measure the efficacy of 222 nanometer light for killing aerosolized virus. And the results that you see here are for two different coronaviruses and also for influenza virus in the green. So what you see is that the two coronaviruses are very efficiently killed by 222 nanometer light. And influenza virus almost as efficiently. So that's very encouraging. So we know that 222 nanometer light can directly inactivate efficiently airborne human coronaviruses. So it's all very well to do those studies in a lab scenario, in a chamber like this. Of course, what you really want to know is, well, is it going to work in a room? If you have these lamps in a room and you have some pathogens in that, airborne pathogens in that room, are they going to be efficiently inactivated? So that's a study that we've actually still ongoing, and the first results have been submitted for publication. And this room is actually the University of Leeds in the UK. So this room is a typical size, moderately small room, 4 meters by 3.3 meters by 2.2 meters height. So what the room has inside it is an air inlet and an air outlet and a source of continuous pathogens. We continuously flood the room with pathogens, and then a sampling point to try and assay what proportion of the pathogens are alive and are dead. And so we turn on the system, we let the pathogens into the room, and we let it equilibrate. So that's what you see on the top right here, this flat area before the lamps are turned on. And then we turn the lamps on. And again, we continue to flood the room with the same level of pathogens when the lamps are turned on. And what you see here are two different studies with two different TLVs, so two different lamp intensities. So the red one is the current regulated lamp intensity. So that's what you could use in practice today. And what you see is when we turn the lamps on, within 15 minutes or so, it was reduced by, it's actually about 92% here. And it maintains that decrease. And if you do the calculation, that corresponds to, if you are just using ventilation, that corresponds to 35 air changes per hour, equivalent to, which is huge. I mean, you can never, in a realistic room, get 35 air changes per hour. That's more than you get in an airplane. So very encouraging that it's rapidly decreased, and then it maintains that decrease as a function of time. And if we use the proposed TLV, what the ACIGH have proposed, you get down to more than 99.9% reduction within a few minutes. And again, it maintains that over time. So this is super encouraging. This does, in a real room-like situation, produce, using current regulatory limits, more than a 90% reduction in live airborne pathogens, which is way more than you could expect to get with any other potential methodology. So yeah, most encouraging. So of course, a 92% reduction in live airborne pathogens means a 92% reduction in the risk of airborne transmission for people that would potentially in that room. And you can actually read this paper. It's when you submit to the journal we did, Scientific Reports, they're automatically posted on their server. So it is available to see, but it hasn't yet been peer reviewed. So we are pretty encouraged at this point that it really will work in real life situations. So I want to talk for the last few minutes on a subject which is close to, I know, some of your hearts, which is the lamps themselves. So when we first got the idea that we wanted to use a shorter wavelength than 254, it was pretty clear immediately that the easiest way to do that was with excimer lamps, and there are two different excimer lamps which potentially come into play here. That's the krypton bromide excimer lamp, which emits at 207, and a krypton chloride lamp, which emits at 222. With the proviso that I talked about before, that they both have fairly long, low intensity tails. We actually started with 207, but actually moved to 222 just because the original lamps that we had, which we bought from Tomsk in Russia, who really, they're the folks who really invented the excimer technology in the first place. The 222 lamp was a lot more efficient, and so produced a lot more light than the 207 lamp. I will say that, I mean, they're fairly big and bulky, but they're incredibly reliable. I mean, the lamps that we bought more than a decade ago are still working just fine. But more recent days, the the manufacturers now are really focusing on 222, and their lamps are increasing in efficiency and decreasing in cost. So a typical lamp from a manufacturer now costs about $200. At the beginning of the COVID crisis, if you'd have asked that question, it would have been $1,000 or maybe a bit more. But again, it's important to think about the filtration, because we know that these high wavelength contaminants are actually would cause health hazards if they're not filtered out. We wanted to understand the wavelength specific risks, because I mean, if you're going to design the right filter, you want to know, well, what wavelengths are you trying to eliminate here? So we got ourselves a broad spectrum UV source and a monochromator, which allowed us to produce very narrow wavelength beams of basically about plus or minus 2 nanometers. So we could then do experiments as a function of wavelength to see just where we needed to cut off to avoid any of these health issues. And here is the sorts of results that we got. And this is in a skin model, looking at the percent of cells with DNA damage as a function of wavelength. And what you see is that around the wavelengths where we want to work at 220 and so on, there is a very low level of DNA damage, if any. None of these are statistically significant compared to 0. But then by 240, it's shot up quite considerably, and by 254, which is where conventional lamps are, you get a lot of DNA damage. So what we know is that you really need to design your filters so that you can eliminate some light above about 235, 240 nanometers. So all the manufacturers are producing excimer lamps, but there are actually alternatives, and the obvious alternative, which when I got into this, I thought, well, it's obvious that we'll move to LEDs eventually, is the LED. But in fact, although there are LEDs in the Far-UVC, and the Berlin team is actually the world experts on that, their efficiency is so small at the moment as to be not useful. So here's a plot actually by that Berlin group, where they look at the external quantum efficiency of LED lamps as a function of wavelength. So by at 250 nanometers, you can actually get an LED which is pretty efficient, which can be maybe 1% efficient, which is pretty good. But when you get down to 222, the efficiency is 10 to the minus 3%. So that's very, very small and entirely impractical for use at the moment. The LED manufacturers say it's just a matter of time before we make more efficient Far-UVC LEDs. That hasn't happened yet, but I think their statement was, well, there was no real reason for us to work in that area because there wasn't an application. Now there is an application. I think a lot of the LED manufacturers are looking into low wavelength technologies. So I am hopeful that there will be some breakthroughs there. But their claim is you do need some sort of technological breakthrough to increase the efficiency around about 220 nanometers. There are other gas phase lamps which are possibilities. The Electrodeless microwave plasma lamp is one possibility, and there's a nice paper published actually from University of Liverpool. Liverpool is actually my home, so it caught my attention. So basically, you generate some microwave power from a microwave oven or similar, and put it into a tunable microwave cavity resonator, and then attach an electrode UV lamp to that, and lo and behold, you get UV light out of it. Sounds simple, but I'm not so sure it really is in practice. But that's, I think, a pretty promising alternative. And there are, of course, there are low pressure zinc and cadmium lamps right now, which you can buy off the shelf, but very low intensity. They're essentially used for calibrating pieces of lab equipment. So they're very, they're very low intensity. But either zinc or cadmium, which are 240 nanometers or 230 nanometers, would actually be pretty good. I think both of them would still need filtering, but they're options. And I don't think anyone's ever tried to build a sort of high intensity, low pressure zinc or cadmium lamp. So there are alternatives to eczema lamps, is my point. Right, I see my time is up, so let me summarize. So this is my picture, that there are 5 features of any methodology that you might think about for reducing airborne infection transmission. Has to be safe, of course, has to be effective, and that's, I think, where a lot of the current alternate technologies fail. If you have an equivalent to 1 or 2 air changes per hour with your technology, it's not going to have much effect. Has to be inexpensive, and Far-UVC is sort of moving in that direction. Needs to be easily deployable on a very large scale, and I think Far-UVC actually does fit that bill, because I mean the manufacturers are making lamps so that you can really just simply replace the overhead lighting that you have in the room with a pendant light, which is combined, visible, and Far-UVC. So not too difficult to retrofit. And very important, I think we've learned this over the last 6 months or so, that should not require active decisions on the part of the public. Because when whatever you ask the public to do, some will mask up, some will social distance, some will have vaccinations. But what we've learned is that a considerable fraction won't. A technology that doesn't require active decisions on the part of the public is clearly a desirable one. So I would make the claim, and I think we can argue the point, that Far-UVC is one of the few, maybe the only approach to fighting COVID transmission that meets all 5 of these criteria. And yeah, to summarize, if you use Far-UVC light within current regulatory limits, it is very efficient at rapidly inactivating all airborne viruses, and so reducing the risk of airborne disease transmission while being safe for human exposure. And it's just very slowly starting to take off in terms of usage. There are several coffee bars in Manhattan actually that use these devices. If you go to the Space Needle in Seattle, that's that very tall, thin building, the elevators have actually got Far-UVC installed in them. And elevators is a really nice application because there aren't many alternatives in an elevator. Miami Dolphins is an American football team, so I'm told, and their training facility is now got Far-UVC light installed in it. So I'll stop there, and I'm very happy to answer any questions from folks in the audience.
Thank you, Dr. Brenner. There are several questions already posted. One is any idea about the lamp life? I think you've partially answered that already.
Yeah, numbers I've heard quoted are of the ballpark of 5,000 hours. Most of the lamp manufacturers are not having 100% duty cycle. In other words, they're cycling on and off. I'm not sure that's actually the best option. I mean, if we're in the room, and I would like that lamp to be on all the time, and if you start coughing, I would like the lamp to be on when you start coughing. So I'm not really sure whether that 5,000 hour number is including or excluding that duty cycle, but essentially we would like it to be a lot longer than it currently is. Sure.
Another question. can the human eyes detect the 222 nanometer light? And how would it be installed with other lighting in a room?
Well, so no is the answer to the first question. You certainly can't see it, nor animals. There are animals that can see UVA and UVB, but we certainly can't. Well, it could be they can be installed in rooms as standalone devices, that just a Far-UVC light installed in the ceiling. It doesn't require any great modifications in terms of electrics. Or as I was saying just now, it can be installed. Some of the manufacturers are producing a combined UVC and visible light with as pendant lights, hanging pendant lights, so it can be installed that way. So installation is not so hard, I think.
If you showed a picture of one that the krypton chloride lamp that you've been experimenting with, one of that size, how many of those would you need per square meter or square yard or square foot in a room with an 8-foot ceiling, like a classroom?
Yeah, so it's a good question. It's entirely dependent on things like how high the lamp is going to be above your head and so on. Yeah, you certainly would, for a classroom, you would certainly imagine that you would need multiple lamps, and I'm picking a number out of the air, and I'm saying 5 or 6, but maybe as much as 10. That's, I mean, what you really want is fairly uniform exposure over the whole of that room. Manufacturers, the early Far-UVC lights that came out had a pretty narrow, solid angle, so the beam was coming down in a pretty tight cone, and that wasn't ideal. Some of the manufacturers now are putting a thin scatterer in front of the lamp, so essentially to increase the solid angle without much decreasing the overall intensity. And so that will reduce the number of lamps that you would need in a given room. So it does depend on the room geometry and very much on the solid angle of the particular lamp in terms of its emission. Thank you.
You showed 3 locations in your slide that have this type of light installed. Do those currently have filtering?
Yeah, I believe so. I personally don't know of any lamps that have been installed without filters. And of course, there may be. That's
okay. And how do you propose that the safety of the lamp to be monitored as time passes? I mean, additional experiments on safety when it actually gets out in public.
Yeah, that's a tough question. Of course, when it's installed, you can always ask people, are you feeling any short-term effects? Are you feeling any stinging in your eyes or anything like that? Yeah, if I can go back, I'd say you should probably distinguish between short-term effects like some potential burning in your eyes, something like that, and long-term effects like skin cancer or long-term damage to the eye. I think it's incredibly unlikely that you're going to have long-term sequelae. So I think what probably we're more concerned with short-term sequelae. And we're starting a study, for example, where we have healthy human volunteers in a room, and we sit them in the room and we get them doing regular tasks, chatting to each other, working on a computer screen, and we're simply going to survey them afterwards and ask, do you feel any effects? We'll survey them immediately after the study, and we'll survey them the next day and the next week. So, as I say, I think short-term studies are much more important than long-term studies, because long-term studies are really hard to do. You have to take long times to do them. But the notion that you could have any long-term consequences is, to my mind, pretty physically impossible. I mean, I just cannot see how you could do that, because to have a long-term consequence for example, in the skin, you have to penetrate to at least to the basal layer of the epithelium, and the light doesn't even get to the top of the epithelium, still less the bottom. And the same thing with the eye. If we expect there's going to be some penetration into the very top layer of the cornea, because the tear layer is typically somewhat thinner than the stratum corneum. But that top layer of the cornea are cells that are already destined to die. They're being sloughed off. But it's, again, physically impossible for the light to penetrate deeper in the cornea, which would give potential long-term problems. So it's a long answer, but I think what my picture is that we need to be concerned about short-term effects. But you could also think about the risk-benefit balance of short-term effects. And even if you did get some tingling in your eyes, and certainly nobody has reported that to date, is that a good is that good in terms of the benefit that you would get from potentially not getting COVID, not getting influenza? So I think you have to think of these things, these risks, not on their own, but in terms of the potential benefit too.
Any concerns with the tolerances of equipment that might be used to create the 222 nanometer as opposed to the 254, which is more dangerous?
Well, first of all, I'd say I'm by no means a expert on these lamps, but I mean that most of the light is definitely going to be on 222, and so if the lamp is maladjusted in some way, you're simply just going to get less 222 nanometer light. So you should certainly think that you should be testing lights when they are installed, and we have a pretty simple way of doing that. That you can we have a nice film detector, which you put pieces of film all in one place in the room or all over the room, and measure it pretty easily. Just measure the darkening, and we have a little app on the iPhone for doing that. So I think that would give you a very clear indication if there were some significant issues with the lamps.
All right. Have there been any studies of the lamps in public places showing reduction of actual COVID transmission? If not, are any planned?
No, and no and no. In my view, it is absolutely impossible to do such a study. Because of all the other places that somebody going into that room might get COVID. I mean, it's really difficult to do health endpoint studies in this scenario. I mean, suppose you install them in a school and you try and do a study in a room where they've got them turned on and a room where they don't. The kids in that school are potentially exposed to viruses in places outside that schoolroom, like in the schoolyard or at home or something. So to power up a epidemiological study is, I think, impossible. So to my mind, and others certainly may disagree, all you can do is do measurements of the reduction of pathogens in an exposed room, and that's the study we're gearing up to do. And again, those pathogens are not going to be SARS-CoV-2 because there's just not enough of them in any given room right now. So we're going to have to measure the reduction in surrogates, and influenza virus is an obvious one. So if you go into a room right now in a cafeteria or something, you will measure significant amounts of influenza virus in that room, but you won't measure significant amounts of SARS-CoV-2 in that room. So you have to do it with surrogates.
Well, as a follow-up thought on that, if you had a captive audience, such as in a prison or in a nursing home, and you only were measuring the differences in convicts and the nursing home clients, then you might actually be able to do what was asked there.
Yeah, it's possible. I mean, I get a bit scared when you talk about individuals who have no choice about being exposed to UV. There is one study going on in a nursing home in Nova Scotia, in fact. Not entirely sure what they're going to be measuring, but I'm assuming it's going to be a health-related outcome. But yes, a quote captive audience would be one approach to doing that sort of study. We have no plans to do that, I should say.
We have another question. I wonder if the dolphins are collecting data that they contract trace and other ways to validate their lights, especially with NFL requiring to play or forfeit games if testing positive for COVID.
Yeah, well, I can't speak for the Miami Dolphins, but I mean, how would you do that experiment? You would turn the, I mean, would you look before the lamps were installed versus since the lamps were installed? I mean, the COVID has changed in that period of time. Or would you have the first team with the lamps and the reserves not having the lamps? I'm not sure how you would do that study. Again, you can do the study of measuring the pathogens in that room, but the health study, not quite sure. Not sure that I see how you would do that study.
I have two questions. First question is ozone generation. Is that going to be a problem with these lamps?
Well, there've been lots of measurements. I mean, first comment to be made is the peak in ozone generation is below 200 nanometers, 180 or 190 or something. So there is some ozone generation. So we have ozone meters all the time, and we've never seen any ozone levels even approaching the EPA limits. It does depend to an extent on the particular lamp design. And Ushio, for example, one of the manufacturers, makes a big deal about their ozone production is super low. But I mean, it's an issue, and any new lamp that comes in the market, I mean, one of the big things will be to test for ozone. But to date, at least, none of the lamps that we've tested have produced in the air anything like the EPA limit.